Can I have friends whom with I have major philosophical disagreements with? I think this is a very interesting question, and I have thought a lot about it, and I also think that in the audience there will be people who are on both sides of this question, which makes it really engaging and something that I want to talk about. So if I were to rephrase the question, it would be, on the one hand, is it even possible to be friends with someone who has radically different worldviews? And on the other hand, why is it even a problem if my friends have radically different worldviews? And I think I will have something to say for both of those opinions. So my answer is a yes and no. And it's not because I'm the kind of guy who considers sitting on the fence to be the ultimate form of enlightened wisdom, and that an intelligent and wise person can never take sides in anything. I think you know that is not the case. I'm saying yes and no because I think it is a question of definition. So let's go for it. Hello and welcome to Valiant Growth, the podcast that empowers you to earn self-esteem, build amazing relationships, and achieve freedom through radical personal development. I'm your host, Philip Frey, and this is the 4th episode of The Art of Stress-Free Relationships. The previous 3 were in order: Friends versus Allies, what is the difference? Redefining Love, or simply Defining Love, and the third one, which is Shared Frameworks for Building Trust. Mind you that these are more the working titles, and you can find the episodes at valiantgrowth.com/archive. It's episodes number 37, 38, and 39. And I recommend listening to them because I will be building on a lot of the foundations laid there. But I think this will make sense even without it. Today's question is, when is it important to have shared views? When is disagreement on certain topics an issue, a threat to the relationship? Which topics specifically are of key importance, and when is it not important? So if you've listened to the first 3 episodes of this series and you thought about them, you might already have an idea of what I'm going to say, because I'm going to combine the conclusions from those 3 to answer this question. So my answer is, it is the nature of a relationship that determines the degree of value affinity necessary to make it functional. Meaning that there is both a level of strictness, but also a degree of flexibility, which I think makes this approach really valuable. So let me give you a quick recap. In Friends vs. Allies, episode 37, I talked about how there are levels of relationship closeness, and how being aware of what level we're taking, where we're putting certain people in our life, can really guide us to have proper interactions with them, and about the dangers of crossing boundaries with people who are not close enough, and about being selective and what kind of filters one must have when letting people get closer. And the levels that I named were accidental allies, or a more specific but less catchy definition is bulk chosen allies. So the people that you have some kind of shared common goal with, but whose presence you cannot individually control in your life. So co-workers is the classic example here. Unless you're the owner or in the human resources department, you will not have a lot of control over your co-workers or your clients. Now you can switch companies and go for better cultures, but you don't really have individual control over who it is. Another example would be your relationship with your grocers. If you're buying your food in a large supermarket, you can choose between supermarkets, but you can't really handpick the staff that you'd like to work with. The next level were chosen allies. So again, these are the people whom you have a shared goal with, and that can be anything from a joint project to to simply having the goal of enjoying yourself, talking about history or Pokemon or whatever. And the difference here is that these are people whom you can individually choose to have or not have. The next level is friends, and friends are people whom you accept into your support network and who accept you in theirs. This is obviously a much closer relationship. The next level is close friends, which includes emotional support. That is what I consider to be the difference between a friend and a close friend. So if I can call you if I need to move some furniture or need a small loan, we're part of a friendship. But if I can call you if I feel depressed or worried or happy, then we're already close friends. The next level is romantic partner, which includes a degree of physicality or sexuality. And then you have co-parent, where you have the joint goal of raising a child together. That is episode 1. The nutshell version of episode 2 is that love, and not just romantic love, is an involuntary response to our highest values. So love is not an act of will, but a reaction to certain qualities and their compatibility with our own values, both conscious and unconscious. And episode 3 talked about how having shared frameworks, having shared ideas, approaches, rules, and agreements enable the building of trust in relationships. And the frameworks that I talked about were economic theory, particularly the difference between the view of interactions being always win-lose versus them being win-win. Philosophy, the value of carefully defining words, the value of intellectual honesty, our views on whether there is an objective reality, whether it can be perceived, and how it can be perceived, what the tools are. More concretely, how can truth be separated from falsehood, where I recommended reason and evidence. And finally, psychology, having a shared agreement on the value of gentleness, on the respect of boundaries, on empathy, on the value of self-knowledge, of introspection, avoiding to take parental roles in adult relationships, and similar questions. So what I'm going to do here in today's episode is simply say that the more close a relationship is, the more agreement is necessary on these subjects. And depending on the nature of a relationship, different areas become more important. So with accidental allies, even asking the question of can I have them if we have radically different worldviews and philosophy and psychology and things like that is kind of a moot point, because you don't have individual control over them. So what I can say here is that a lot of happiness and relationship improvement can be had through designing your life in such a way in which you can reduce accidental allies. And since many of them come from the work world, I think this is one of the biggest and often overlooked benefits of entrepreneurship, that you can choose who you're working with. And also you can even, to some extent, choose your clients and definitely your suppliers, at least to a much greater degree than as an employee. And then there are more and more extreme or braver or more interesting variations on lifestyle design, where you actually reduce the number of accidental allies even further. And I believe it is possible to get to a state where you have very, very few or no accidental allies. But this is a discussion for another day. When it comes to chosen allies, I would recommend having agreement on economic theory. And I call economic theory, as I said before, the question of what is the proper function and dynamics of relationships. Is it a law of nature that all interactions have a winner and loser, that in trade and in other relationships somebody always has to sacrifice themselves or be tricked or be forced for the other person to be able to benefit, which is a much more prevalent view, then you might imagine the whole idea of communism is based on this idea. Or what I believe in is that all voluntary relationships where there is no force or fraud involved are by definition win-win, because they wouldn't exist if people didn't choose to get involved with them. Now, the question of is it beneficial for someone is a very, very tricky and difficult question, because how can you say if this or that is beneficial? Everybody's going to have a different option on many questions around this. But what you can say with certainty is that there is the view that is beneficial. So the parties entering an agreement, a deal, an interaction, both perceive it to be beneficial. And that is the win-win worldview. That is the win-win economic theory. And I suggest that if you're dealing with people who don't subscribe to a win-win theory, and they're not going to tell you this, and they might not even be aware of it, but if you pay attention to what they say and what they do, you will very quickly observe it. There is a surprising number of people out there, for example, who will feel unease if you're very happy after an interaction with them, because to them that's a signal that they've lost somehow, and they don't know how, but they've lost somehow, so they must retaliate. And again, this might sound surprising, but if you pay attention, I believe that you will see it. And I think this is the minimum criteria for chosen allies. So if they're not win-win, I wouldn't go and form an interaction, a relationship with them, and I don't recommend it to you either. Because inevitably there are moments where certain interactions stop being win-win. And this can be through malice, or this can be through simply psychological reasons, with people bringing out their trauma into the interaction. But these moments need not be detrimental overall, because if you both share the idea that the purpose of a relationship is for both parties to benefit, then there's a common ground that you can return to, and you can speak the same language in saying that, okay, this particular moment, I did not feel that I benefited from it, so let's discuss it and let's make sure that it doesn't repeat. But if you don't have that agreement, you've got no common ground to return to, and it's not going to work. So you're either on your guard all the time or dominating all the time, and that is no way to have an enjoyable relationship. But, as I said, it's not necessary to have anything beyond this. There are many activities and shared goals that you can pursue together, even without having a full and explicit philosophical and psychological agreement. You can have a chess buddy and never ever need to talk about the value of defining words or intellectual honesty, because it is simply not necessary within that context. And what they do outside of your bloody battles of complete destruction is not that important or significant to you. But it does become significant once you accept someone into your support network. And this is when we get to friendship. And here I suggest that at least the philosophical agreement is necessary. So you're going to be having conversations with a friend. You're going to be discussing issues. You're going to have differing viewpoints. And in those moments, if you can't fall back, if there's any kind of issue or disagreement, if you can't fall back on the questions of, let's use the right words, let's be careful with definitions, let's be intellectually honest, let's use reason and evidence as our tools for determining truth or falsehood, or the value of different opinions, if you don't have that, then you don't have a neutral ground of arbitration, and you're going to have a hard time. And this might sound a little bit strange to you, and I suggest listening to the previous episode, but I will say that I have personally tried this out. I personally sat down with a person, and after a few conversations, once we got a little bit closer, I said, okay, so what are your views on reality? Do you think there is an objective reality out there? how do you separate truth from falsehood? And I'm curious about what you have to say, and also here are my opinions, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is that I consider these things to be important. And amazingly, the person didn't just get up and walk away. It actually worked. It actually worked really well, and we had an interesting discussion on Plato and Aristotle and the different strands and schools of philosophy and things like metaphysics and epistemology. And that was more intellectual curiosity kind of things, but we addressed the key question of how you separate truth from falsehood, and we actually used the approach in the future. And I will say that I approached the person with a genuine curiosity, a genuine humility, and being very careful not to be dominating over her. And this is why it worked. I began with the assumption that I will carefully consider her views and not just use it as an opportunity to enforce mine. And that made it work. And the other reason why philosophical agreement is so crucial is because they are a part of your support network. Their interaction with the world will have a direct impact on your life, and yours will have an impact on their lives. So if any of you are irrational and using the wrong methodologies in some fields, well, in those fields, you're going to have a lot of trouble. And if you've decided to be friends, that quickly becomes shared trouble. So if I'm irrational about my financial dealings and I do it based on wishful thinking, based on all sorts of biases, rather than reason and evidence, I will quickly run into trouble. And if I run into trouble and you're my friend, you're partially in trouble as well. You don't have to sacrifice yourself, of course, but as long as we maintain this friendship, if this friendship includes an element of forming a financial support network, I will come to you and I will say, hey man, can you lend me X amount? And it suddenly becomes very important. And even in that moment, so even if this happens, if we have a shared agreement of reason and evidence, we can sit down and you can say, okay, look, I'll give you this X amount, but let's look into this. Let's see what went wrong. Because I can bail you out now, but I can't bail you out forever. But you're a person that I trust, you're a person whose integrity and intelligence I believe in, so I think if we look at what happened and apply the methodology of reason and evidence, perhaps this can be avoided in the future. And on the next level, if we are close friends, so if we offer emotional support to one another, all of this applies, everything discussed previously applies, plus we need psychological agreement. We need to agree on the value of boundaries, on the value of gentleness, on the value of empathy, on the value of self-knowledge, in a very similar fashion to the financial example. So if I come to you for advice and support, but you totally cross my boundaries and you're not gentle and you show no empathy, our close friendship can't survive because we can't have an emotional support network together since you don't have emotional support skills. And similarly to the financial example, if I'm continuously depressed and always rely on your support to keep me going, but I'm never willing to delve into self-knowledge, to get a therapist, to journal, to introspect, to uncover my history, to start working on the issue. And if we don't agree on the value of that, I will be forever claiming your support over and over again, and that is not sustainable. And please don't get me wrong, my view on relationships isn't that coming with a problem to someone is an issue and is something to be avoided and is something to be minimized. I don't believe that. But I do believe that there must be some kind of progression. So if it's always the same issues, it eventually becomes tiresome and there's no new angle, there's no step forward. That is not an enjoyable or sustainable way forward. So on the next level, on the level of romantic partners, you obviously need agreement over the definition of love. You can't have in a romantic relationship people demanding that you must love me and you're not loving me enough. That is not functional, and that is not sustainable, and that is not, I believe, in line with reality. And if you adopt the definition that love is an involuntary response to our highest values, that code gives you a very clear path and a very clear answer to most issues where the amount of love that you get is unsatisfactory. It gives you a very clear answer because there are really two possibilities. If I want you to love me more, I must either improve myself. If you hold the right values, I must simply put more work in and become more virtuous and build the skills that you will respond to. And if you don't do that, then the issue is with your highest values. And that's very, very nice and clear cut and very functional. It gives answers to most situations. But there's a very important caveat here. This approach must be coupled with psychological understanding and an understanding of the fact that our highest values and the patterns that we respond to with love are very strongly influenced by our history, and that must be taken into account. And there's the famous example of the entire life of Ayn Rand, where because she didn't take them into account, even though she worked with this definition, which is an almost exact quotation of Ayn Rand, they failed spectacularly, and they failed because they didn't include the element of psychology and the role of emotions into them. But if they are, I believe that excellent romantic relationships are possible and would have been possible to her as well. And that is why it's important to have both a shared definition of love, but as a very important addition, the psychological background and recognizing the value of introspection, of self-knowledge, etc., that I've already talked about before. And when considering promoting someone to the status of co-parent, of course, you need to agree on parenting, and that includes both practical matters, and I would say it also includes both parties' historical evaluation of their own parents and the quality of the parenting that they have received. Because, as it is with love, many of our parenting choices and our parenting styles overall will be very strongly influenced by what we received. And we might have the best intentions, but if we haven't gotten a clear understanding of our own parenting and what is worth keeping and what must be rejected and focused on because it will be recurring in our own parenting, is very important. So both parties must have a good understanding of the history of their own childhood and the history of their partner's childhood, have a clear judgment of what worked and didn't work, and have an agreement on that judgment. So we might agree, for example, that we don't spank and we don't put our children into public schools and we treat them as equals as much as possible, and that's all great. But if my mother was passive aggressive and I don't know about it and I haven't condemned that and rejected that as a style of parenting, and you don't know about it and agree with my judgment, then it will pop up in my own style, and we both must be vigilant with this, because that is perhaps the greatest danger of parents who have the best intentions in the world, the long shadow of our past. So this is the framework that I think in when it comes to the question of, can I have friends with different philosophy, worldviews, political views, religious views, etc. I try to think of where they are and what kind of relationship we're having. Is it a close friendship? Is it a friendship? Do I have romantic intentions? Is it simply a chosen ally? That influences very much what I consider important and not important. And how this can be applied is that you look at your relationships in the present and you keep an eye out in the future. And if you see disagreements and you cannot solve those disagreements, then you simply demote the person on the scale. I don't think you necessarily have to break up the relationship just because it's not working on a specific level and you don't have a full agreement on a specific level. It's possible that you can keep that relationship going, but instead of having that person as a friend, you have them as an ally, and you restrict your activities together to the thing that works, and you cut out the things that don't work, and you establish boundaries and stick to them. And thus you don't necessarily have to end relationships over disagreements. And on the other side of the question, on the other hand, you must be careful to have these agreements and not try to have very incompatible friends for the notion of diversity, of things like that. If you want to have divergent viewpoints, if you want your worldviews to be challenged, I think that is great, and you can benefit from that, and it can lead you to getting closer to the truth, whether it is switching your views or simply sharpening them and having a more clear definition because you've engaged in debate. I think that is great, but those kinds of discussions can be perfectly done in the context of an alliance. We can have great philosophical conversations with our afternoon cup of tea and not form any kind of support network together. And that makes it sustainable. And I believe if you adopt this approach, it will enable you to A, have better relationships, and B, have relationships with people who are not fully compatible and get the best that you can get and give the best that you can give and still maintain some form of relationship without major friction going on. And to bring this into the world of practice, or rhetoric for those of you in the know, let's look at some concrete examples. So as I've said before, I consider that co-workers and clients and generally the world of work interactions is best not combined with the world of close friends or even friendships in general. So I consider that it's best to keep a distance from your co-workers and clients and things like that. So you can absolutely have a client or a co-worker or a supplier who radically differs with your political views or whatever, as long as that they share the same economic theory, as long as that in your interaction they go for win-win and they understand the value and importance of that, and you can raise a legitimate complaint and it will be heard when it doesn't meet that criteria, you can make it work. But on the other hand, if you see that this person operates with a win-lose mentality, and if it is a chosen ally or an individually chosen ally as opposed to a bulk chosen ally, I would say end the relationship. And if it's an employment situation where you don't have a control, I would suggest that if a win-lose mentality is pervasive in the company or in the organization, and you can find an organization that is more win-win oriented, even if it's not 100% of everybody there, it still might be worth looking into moving into that direction. Is it preferable to have co-workers and clients and suppliers who share your philosophy and share your psychological views? Of course, I think that's clearly preferable. But if you cannot get that going, I wouldn't fret too much about it. It's not a major issue due to the nature of the relationship. Another classic example of chosen alliances are therapists and coaches. And again, here, I think you can have a relationship with a therapist and a coach, even if you don't see eye to eye on issues of philosophy or the definition of love. If you agree on economic theory, then that's good. And this is also a special case where you kind of must break the system in a way. It's an exception where you also must have psychological agreement, of course. If they don't believe in empathy and you do, or they don't practice it, that's a major issue. So it is a good example of taking a look at the nature of the relationship and focusing on the specific areas of agreement that are important. So I'm a libertarian, more specifically an anarcho-capitalist, and more specifically I find the moral arguments to be the most convincing and important. That is that government is an immoral entity. Can I have a coach or a therapist who, gasp, believes instead that the consequentialist argument is more important? That is that government is inefficient and it makes us poorer and less happy. Though with great regrets, I think that relationship is still workable. Let's look at another example. Let's look at the question of religion. So if you are a Christian, for example, can you have an atheist friend? And you might be surprised, but my opinion is that you usually cannot. Can you have an atheist ally? Absolutely. If the relationship doesn't touch on the question and there's no support networks, absolutely. But if you have a friend who's an atheist and you're a Christian and you cannot get to a point of agreement, even though you try and you drill down to the philosophical roots, but you still can't agree, that is a major issue, I would say, because one of you is irrational in this equation. And if one of you is irrational about religion, that's a significant risk that they will be irrational about something else in their lives. And if you're forming a support network, which I consider to be the definition of a friendship, irrationality is the biggest threat to the survival of a support network. So for instance, if prayer is the most effective way of getting a good harvest, but your atheist friend is snubbing at the gods and reading Dawkins and refusing to go to church and sacrificing goats in his basement and incurs the wrath of the gods and his harvest is ruined, well, you'll be covering that issue. You'll be feeding him all throughout the winter. So suddenly it becomes very important that you have congruence on this question. And that was a jokey example, but if you can't agree on your epistemology on the question of how do you separate truth from reality, that will never be just limited to the question of religion. And at any given point, I believe that you will have problems when you have a disagreement of going to this impartial arbiter of methodology, of reason and evidence, because one party is not following it in one key aspect of their lives. So how reliable are they in other key aspects of their lives? And please, again, let me be clear here. When I say you can't have an atheist friend as a Christian or a Christian friend as an atheist, I don't mean that you have to be enemies or that you have to completely ignore one another. I have Christian allies that I collaborate with on certain issues, and it's great. What I am saying is that I don't suggest that you get beyond a certain level of closeness until you can reach an agreement on this question. And if you believe that reality is objective and there's only one version of the truth, you should inevitably come to a conclusion that you both agree with. If you both believe that, if you're both intellectually honest, this disagreement shouldn't last forever. It's going to take some time to change long-held beliefs, perhaps, but it cannot last forever. And if it does, then there's a disagreement on a more fundamental level, and that makes a closer friendship impractical. So to sum up, once again, it is the nature of a relationship that determines the degree of value affinity necessary to make it work. Thank you for listening to Valiant Growth, and I dare you to flourish today. I've come to a point where I have too many announcements and information to share here at the end of the show, so I've decided to simply focus on a few key aspects every time and cover them gradually. So today I will say, if you enjoyed the show, please go to iTunes, find Valiant Growth there, subscribe, and leave a review. And if you leave it in your real name and you reference your website if you have one, that's even better. And I might even mention you on the show. The reason why I'm asking for this is that it helps spread the show. It more specifically helps people find it. So if they search for self-esteem, for example, the more subscribers and reviews I have, the higher I will score, the higher Valiant Growth will score. And do your own research, but I think this podcast will help people much more than some of the stuff out there. So everyone would benefit if it would show up higher on the rankings. So if you can help with that, I would really appreciate it. And also I invite you to go to valiantgrowth.com/books to find some of the books that I recommend. And I know that many of my listeners are either avid readers or avid audiobook listeners. And though you might have a long reading list already, I believe you will find some books there that deserve to jump in front of the queue. And I'm building this whole section called, at the moment, it's called Valiant Library. And I'm going to include short reviews of books. I will also include podcasts, and I will also include YouTube channels that I consider worth checking out. And I will also add a little bit of a description so you know what it's about. At the moment, I only have books, and it's something that I'm working on, though by the time you check it, there might be more. But I already have a number of books there, and I recommend that you go to valiantgrowth.com/books and check out some of the best stuff out there, some of the most useful books for personal development. If you click on the links there, those are all Amazon affiliate links, and I get a small cut of the price of the book if you purchase it, or even if you purchase something else after you've clicked in the next 24 hours. But that's a pretty minor thing. And the major motivation that I have to put the Valiant Library up there is that there's a deluge of self-help / personal development books out there. And most of them are really bad and a waste of time. So I think that having a good curated list will be a massive win-win-win for everybody involved. And if you're familiar with the Personal MBA, which is a collection of curated books on business education, well, I'm looking to gradually build something similar with the Valiant Library, something that is like that, except it's about personal development. So check it out. Check out the book part of it at valiantgrowth.com/books. Oh, and also this is part of a series. So as I said, starting from episode 37, you have the art of stress-free relationships, and another series that you might want to consider starting from episode 16 all the way through episode 20 is the core principles of relationships, which is the deeper end, the more foundational end of what I'm talking about here. And I often reference it directly or indirectly in my discussions, some core ideas that I believe to be crucial in having amazing relationships. And you can find the full archive at valiantgrowth.com/archive.